Well, we want to welcome you to the Horse Breeding and Selection Series, the one of 4 live web presentations. My Horse University and Equine Network are excited to offer horse enthusiasts a science-based, fun series of courses along with the live web presentations. Dr. Shelle is our expert tonight. He is also the author of Breeding for a Champion article that was published in the January 2008 Dressage Today magazine. This web presentation will also be recorded and will be uploaded in the course for anyone who is unable to attend the online presentation or who would like to view the presentation again. Dr. Shelle grew up in the rural community of Hudson, Michigan as the oldest boy in a family of 14 children. He is active in horse and livestock industry from a very early age. This led him to enroll at Michigan State University and earn his BS degree in animal husbandry in 1973. Then he managed the Horse Center. Dr. Shelle also received his MS degree in animal husbandry in 1980 and his PhD in animal science at Michigan State as well. He presently teaches 6 courses in animal science, advises 90 undergraduates, and serves on 4 graduate committees. He is also involved in all major departmental curricular developments and has served as the chairperson of the Department Curriculum Committee on several occasions. Just a couple logistics while the live web presentation is going on. If you do have questions and they're pertaining to the slides that are being shown, feel free to type those in the chat. Also make sure that you send it to everyone so everyone can see your question. We will also be doing a question and answer at the end of the presentation as well. And we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, Dr. Shelle.
Thank you, Kate. Hopefully, can everyone hear me all right, I hope. We want to talk a little bit about some of what we wrote in regard to the article that was in the Dressage magazine in regard to developing a breeding program. One of the things that is difficult with this kind of material is to try to put this into a single article and cover all the bases, which is what I tried to do. Sometimes makes it just a little bit confusing. I hope that we can do a good job of trying to clarify some of that and make sure that we have the right kind of understanding in regard to sort of what I meant by some of that terminology. We'll talk some about pedigrees. We'll talk some about different types of breeding programs, and then the kinds of tools we have available in regard to trying to breed horses. One thing I want to mention at the outset is that these principles are principles that we teach in our advanced horse breeding course at Michigan State University. It actually is, the course is called Animal Science 414, and it's actually called Advanced Animal Breeding, but we use the horse program here as a model because I've been involved in that breeding program since the late 70s in regard to making those decisions on matings at that farm. And there was a plan in place, and the plan makes some sense. I'm not saying that it's the perfect plan, but it in fact makes some sense, and you can see over almost 30 years now how that plan has progressed and ended up developing a certain type of horse. So we kind of want to start off with the idea of thinking about what you want to do relative to a breeding program. There's lots of different types of breeding programs. We can look at a breeding program where someone is interested in kind of being in it for the long run. In other words, producing their own females that will go back in the herd, producing the next generation of breeding horses for the herd. Or we can look at a type of breeding program where we're trying to breed 1 or 2 mares, produce some sort of income for the farm, develop a breeding program that has a reasonable amount of success in a very short period of time, but may not have the longevity of some other types of program that we might want to be looking at. We might want to consider the types of horses that we want to end up breeding. One of the things that's happened today, and I question somewhat its relevance, and especially within some breeds, is that in the case of performance and halter, we have a tendency to have produced specialists. It is my belief that within most breeds there was an intention when breeds were developed that they had a certain characteristic or conformational characteristics that made them resemble one another. And then the performances that they ended up trying to achieve within those breeds were based upon the kinds of things that people wanted to do with that type of horse. What we've done today is in many cases, and we have a breed of horse where we have very specific horses that do English pleasure, Western pleasure, specific horses for cutting or reining or halter, and kind of nary the twain shall meet. They're horses that don't necessarily, some of those performance horses don't necessarily meet the halter qualifications, and sometimes don't even meet breed qualifications relative to type. So you need to think about how you want to do this. It's my belief, and I've always tried to adhere to this at Michigan State and relative to our breeding program, is that we want to develop horses that are athletic, that have reasonably good minds, that are trainable, and are also beautiful. We don't care what performance discipline they end up in, and we've had them enter all sorts of disciplines, but we want them to head in the direction of being a performance horse, but also carry the conformational characteristics considered by that breed. So we're doing more of a combination type of breeding. So we need to think about what you're going to emphasize in regard to your breeding program. There's not a wrong decision here, but you need to realize that you need to make a decision before you ever start breeding. When I talk to breeding groups or people that are interested in breeding, I always say the first thing you need to consider before you make the mating is what are you going to do with the offspring? Where will that offspring go? Is that offspring immediately for sale? Is it meant to be a replacement for an older broodmare? Or is it one that we're simply going to produce so that we can enjoy having a foal on the property and raising a young horse? Excuse me. The first type of breeding program that I want to talk about is one that tends to be very popular and works pretty effectively for that person that might have one or two broodmares. It has an interest in producing an offspring that's going to be sold relatively quickly. It probably doesn't create a long-term breeding program because it tends not to be very consistent in the way in which it uses pedigrees and some of the breeding tools that we'll talk about. And this is what I like to refer to as magazine or jackpot breeding. It's trying to get the one great one. It's trying to breed an individual to a particular stallion and trying to produce an offspring that is going to be extremely successful in whatever division it's going to be shown or compete in. But in general, there is no or little concern for pedigree mating, and we'll talk more about pedigree mating a little bit later on. The matings are made based upon selecting two horses. The female may have been, in the case of the picture here, may have been an extremely successful gaited horse. We then breed it to the most popular gaited horse of the time. And it provides two kind of interesting scenarios. It provides us an opportunity to perhaps produce one that's really, really talented, but it may also provide the opportunity for us to have a marketing tool immediately. When breeding to that really popular stallion, there's a fair number of people out there looking for their offspring, especially very early on. Now, this is a tough game to play, and the main reason it's a tough game to play is because horses are only popular based on what they did for you recently. So quite frequently, the idea is to actually get a mare bred to a stallion who you believe will be extremely popular at some point, but has not yet reached his zenith, so that when he does, you have offspring available for sale. One of the problems with this one is that you really don't use any effective breeding principles that we'll talk about a little bit later. It's very hit or miss. You can inject some of this if you think about some of the breeding principles, but it tends to be very hit or miss. The difficulty with this is that what do you do with your mistakes? And this can be a real problem because we don't use some of the tried and true breeding principles that are a little bit more reliable in this type of a mating scheme. Mistakes will occur, and sometimes those mistakes can be a real problem because they may not. If we're breeding for performance horses at a very high level, sometimes those horses don't have the most family-friendly dispositions, and as a result of that, if they aren't national quality or very, very high quality horses, you have to sell them, and in trying to sell them, you may end up in a situation where you've got a horse that really is no more than a youth or amateur horse, but doesn't have a disposition to go along with it. So these kinds of horses can present real problems in the long run relative to a breeding program. Another type of breeding program is something that I like to refer to as topside based, or it's a stallion based program. And in this scenario, what we try to do is, there's a number of these breeding programs in the United States that have been quite successful. You need to understand and recognize the limitations of each of these breeding programs. This stallion that is shown in this picture is actually a stallion that was produced by a topside breeding program, where someone was extremely oriented towards producing a sire line that followed some very specific characteristics, horses that had lots of trot, lots of presence, very brilliant and animated horses. And they did this through generations on one farm. What you do in this scenario is you produce male families. The problem with this is that the families is unlikely to occur because you can only use so many stallions. So with limited number of mares, we tend to produce single male families. That produces a limited gene pool. We don't have the opportunity to expand beyond that very often when we're dealing with a certain line of stallions, unless we go out and get some females to increase our genetic base. You may need to buy females frequently, and in fact most stallion-based breeding programs, if they're exclusively stallion-based, will have a tendency to have to do that. They'll have to go out and buy females because, after all of the daughters of that sire may not work appropriately when being rebred to that same sire, so, or to half-brothers and those types of scenarios. Generally, in this type of program, it's very difficult to eliminate problems when they do occur that are genetic problems, because when you're breeding to one stallion line, if you eliminate the problem quite frequently, because you may only have at any given time 1 or 2 stallions from that line that are still fertile and producing lots of offspring, you may have to eliminate your entire top side of your breeding program. So it does cause some real problems or real concerns long term in that regard. The very best breeders that I know, and some of the best breeders that I've had an opportunity to be involved with, have been involved in a variety of breeds. And one of my very favorites in this regard was actually a guy by the name of Hank Wieskamp, who really developed both a top side and a bottom side breeding program where he had sire line and dam lines. And it makes some sense in a breeding program to do both if you've got those kinds of numbers. But most of us don't have those kinds of numbers, so we have to look at kind of an either-or scenario. The breeding program at Michigan State is female-based. A very large percentage of the breeders that I've been associated with over the years that I know that have been successful have been those people that have bred or have used female or male-based breeding programs. What you do in this scenario is you produce female families. The beauty of this is that you can start with a select number of females that are not closely related, produce male families from each of those females, and then use those females in a variety of ways on different stallions. So in some cases, we have male families at Michigan State that are not allowed to produce stallions. Why are they not allowed to produce stallions? Because the male family simply isn't good enough. They can produce horses that typically are terminal crosses, or horses that can go out and show and perform and do all of those things, but they may not have the genetics to go on and be outstanding individuals relative to a breeding sire. So we end up some of those male families may not be allowed to produce stallions. Nice part about this one is it's really kind of an inexhaustible gene pool, because you can always produce females by different stallions, by a variety of stallions, and still maintain that female family. At some point, it almost always requires that you go out and get some of that genetics again to sort of reestablish some of the genetics that was originally in the family. But it is one that is, if you've got problems with it, it's relatively easy to eliminate those problems, because you can eliminate the mares that have them, still have mares from the family that you can go on with, and continue to develop the family long term. Both this and a stallion-based program are long-term breeding programs. Some of us may not be interested in doing that. It was my goal when I started at Michigan State was to try to breed horses there for as long as I have already, and thought that my opportunity to do this has been a surprising one to me, to do it for as many years as I have. But it takes about 20 years to really establish a breeding program that is either sire or mare based. The nice part about establishing mare families is if a stallion works on one, he will likely work on many. Therefore, it's pretty easy to find. Once you get a good one started, you can kind of very easily figure out how to use those mares on the appropriate stallions to be reasonably successful. It requires, and we'll talk more about this at length when we talk about personal tools that are required of a breeder. But when you do this, it requires that you evaluate your mare quality regularly. We do this annually. We use a scoring system. We don't score every year because we're typically scoring many of the same horses. But we do use a scoring system, and annually I have a group of breeders that I respect that are part of my advisory board come in and evaluate the horses, tell me what I'm doing wrong, what I'm doing right, and it really helps. It helps reduce my opportunity for barn blindness. This bottom side breeding program requires breeding to outside stallions at some point. You're going to want to either produce a stallion in the herd that you can use on a variety of mares, or you're going to want to continue to develop a strain of females, and you may want to do that by using some outside stallions. So it requires that you're going to use some outside breedings on a reasonably regular basis. It's not uncommon in a breeding program like this to actually have stallions on farm who are produced from one or more of the mare families that are being used on multiple mare families back within the herd. And this can work very effectively. The tools that we're going to try to talk about that are tools that have been established that are used in every type of breeding program there is are performance records, and we'll talk a little bit about the performance records that are available in horses. Inbreeding, which is a tool that can be used in a variety of species. Line breeding, which is really very similar to inbreeding. We can use outcrossing and crossbreeding. These are used extensively in other species to produce lines that are very effective in producing product and doing a variety of things. People don't think very much about this. Some of the truly great breeders that have bred horses for long periods of time within breed actually use these tools and understand them. The average breeder tends not to use them, and in fact in some cases have been led to believe that these tools actually are injurious to the horse and may cause problems. Using them appropriately makes an awful lot of sense within some of these breeding programs. Many of them are long-term tools. They're not tools you use once and decide you're done with it. They're tools that you have to use for a long period of time. The personal tools that a breeder has to have to be a good evaluator, to be a breeder, is one, being a good evaluator of livestock. This one's one that takes some time. Excuse me, on a drink here. You've got to spend some time with this if you want to become good at it. If you're not good, or this is of little or no interest to you, you probably don't want to become a breeder, because you have to be able to evaluate livestock at a very high level to be able to become a successful breeder. It can be learned. You can teach yourself this, and you can become a student of the skeleton of a horse and the conformation of a horse and its performance potential and its performance ability, and you can become very good at this. It's also inborn. There's some of you that I'm sure right now have all of the tools necessary to become an extremely good evaluator, but may or may not have had the chance to actually go out and spend much time evaluating or enhancing those tools. So you can do this, and in many cases it will take some real effort on your part, and being able to follow someone around that you really respect and admire in terms of their ability to be a good evaluator of livestock. You must try to eliminate barn blindness. I have a distinct advantage in this regard because I don't own the horses that I breed. However, I have tremendous difficulty with barn blindness even to this day, where I think that horses that I've bred for some particular reason are better than horses that someone else has bred. In one particular case, we had a young stallion in the state that was a very successful show horse that we were showing with students. There was another stallion in the state, and we stood second to him most of the time whenever the horses were shown. I always liked our stallion better than the other horse. Had a chance to breed to that horse when his stud fee was $2,000 when he stood in the state of Michigan. Didn't breed to him. We bred to our horse, let the horse go on and show. The other stallion eventually became a national champion, and then when I did eventually decide that I was going to breed to the horse, his stud fee was $5,000, and I could have bred mares to him at $2,000, but I was too barn blind and bullheaded to recognize that other people's horses may have an awful lot to offer your breeding program. You need to learn to read and understand pedigrees and how they are used. What a pedigree really does is provides a history of breeding performance in an animal. We'll show you some tools that we're developing at Michigan State, at least within Arabian horses. There are some of these tools available in other breeds, especially in European warmbloods, but most of those we don't have really good numbers on the horses that are in this country, but there's some really good numbers on horses in Europe in regard to estimated breeding values, and we'll talk more about those a little bit later. But that's really what a breeding history does, is gives you an estimated breeding value of a horse, or the kinds of things that you think a horse might be able to do. The other thing you need to have is courage. Others will doubt you, and you'll end up in a situation where people are criticizing or concerned about what kind of breeding program that you have. But if you have a plan and you understand where you're going and you understand that you have to take baby steps, that you'll eventually get to the right place, that courage will really hold you in good stead. You have to be convinced that what you're doing is correct. And this gets back to the original premise that we started talking about, which is that we have to make sure that we have a plan when we start out trying to breed horses. And then lastly, and probably most importantly actually, is you need to produce a marketable product. If you have a goal to breed a particular kind of horse, and that horse is totally foreign to the market that you have available to you, and it's not the type of horse that people are interested in, what is the point in producing it? There are a number of those types of horses being bred in the United States by breeders who believe, based upon the history, period, that that's the greatest value in breeding that type of horse, but the product itself is not very marketable except to those people that have that same interest. And those tend to be very limited number of marketing opportunities. So you need to try to produce something that's going to be marketable and can be marketable to the masses. It means it's probably got to have a good disposition. It means it's got to be relatively beautiful, or at least symmetrical and balanced and those sorts of things. And then it probably needs to perform some function reasonably well. Using performance records, it really is helpful in trying to develop a breeding program that makes some sense. Using performance records really requires that you're a good evaluator. There's a number of records that we have available to us that we really don't think of them as being performance records. The reality is that show performance, even though it's one person's opinion on any given day, but if a horse has been winning consistently under a variety of judges, there's probably some truth to the fact that the horse has some merit in regard to that performance division or halter division or whatever it is that the horse is competing in. So there's some merit to that. So show performance has some value in regard to looking at performance records, especially if that's our endpoint. If our endpoint's the show ring, rather than a horse that you have in mind, then you probably want to get animals that have been successful in the divisions you'd like to compete in. When we look at things like race performance, usually this is an honest measure. In other words, it's a race time, it's finishes, it's handicap, it's the amount of earnings. All of those things are relatively honest, as honest as racing can be in regard to evaluating a horse. So race performance becomes one of those performance records that we look at as well. Confirmation scoring, some sort of a system where animals are actually scored. We have those sorts of scoring systems in sport horses. We have those sorts of scoring systems in some of the warm blood registries. We have developed a scoring system that at Michigan State that deals with Arabian horses. Has about 750 horses in the database now. And from that we've developed estimated breeding values. What an estimated breeding value is simply an estimate of the genetic difference an individual expresses in its phenotype that can be passed on to its offspring. And we'll talk more about those in a bit when we get down to actually evaluating some of these things. Disposition evaluations, trainability. There's very few of those available. There are some on some European horses. We've tried for a number of years to develop a trainability scorecard on our horses at the university, and have had some difficulty trying to come up with something that we think is very meaningful. But it is something that you need to evaluate. And in many cases, it's as simple as talking to trainers that have used those pedigrees and trying to get some sense of how trainable those individuals are. You need to be critical of your horses in your program so that you understand the performance that your horses have actually been able to produce. If a horse doesn't perform up to the level that you'd like it to, doesn't necessarily mean that it's not something that you can use in a breeding program, but you have to understand what its merits are and when that animal can be used appropriately. And then realize that people and programs that have other people in programs have a great deal to offer your program in regard to performance records and understanding the performance of an individual. When we talk about estimated breeding values, these are some numbers that we actually developed, and these are actually estimated breeding values, for two horses. The horse on the left is MSU Eternity. Horse on the right is Huck's Legacy. And these are the same characteristics. These horses, all of the horses in this system have actually been evaluated for 18 conformational characteristics, including all sorts of characteristics of the leg, the body, the neck, the head, and those are based upon characteristics that are desired within Arabian horses. So each of these horses show some breeding values. The number that we're looking at is actually the number that is the difference between that horse and the average of the population of horses at Michigan State. So for an estimated breeding value. So that these are compared to a population average. So in the case of head, and these are two horses I want to show you because we're going to follow up on Eternity and Huck's Legacy, and we'll actually show you some pictures of these horses a little bit later on. But in the case of head, Eternity, if we look at these, the larger the number gets, the coarser the head gets. The smaller the number gets, the finer the head gets, with the idea that a head right in the middle would be ideal. So you can see that she's slightly coarse. He's quite refined or frail in this head. And if we look at neck arch, she has very little arch to her neck. He has a great deal of arch. Neck length, both horses are just a little less than the average of the population, although she's closer to the average than he is. Body, she is deeper bodied than he is, because as we go negative, it ends up being that you have less body. Pelvic slope, they are very much in opposition to one another. And then quality, she's on the coarse end, he's on the fine end. We're not saying either of these things are desirable or undesirable. They're just number scores. Where do we get these numbers? Well, we get these numbers from scoring the individuals themselves. So Huck's Legacy's been scored, MSU Eternity's been scored, and then all of the offspring of Huck's Legacy has been scored. All of the offspring of Eternity have been scored. All the brothers and sisters of these horses that are in the herd have been scored. And all of those numbers come together to come up with these estimated breeding values. And they work pretty effectively, and we'll show you how effectively in this one mating that we've actually performed this mating 4 times on farm. And she is in fact expecting a foal this year by him as well. So it's one of the ways that we can kind of demonstrate how something like this actually works reasonably well. Using inbreeding, line breeding, and outcrossing with inbreed, which is really more breed development than anything else, is really important to understand in regard to tools that we have available. Some people will say inbreeding and line breeding are not something you want to do. Others will tell you that it's absolutely the right thing to do. I believe that you use all of these tools in some regard, but you use them to try to produce the type of offspring or individual that you'd like to have. All right, inbreeding and line breeding. This horse in the picture is actually a very intensely bred horse. This horse was bred by a lady by the name of Basie Tankersley in Tucson, Arizona, who we recently went into partnerships with. Basie has the second longest continuous Arabian breeding program in the United States. Michigan State has the third longest continuous Arabian breeding program in the United States. And then Cal Poly Pomona has the first longest continuous Arabian breeding program in the United States. Basie Tankersley had one outstanding sire. She was very, very, very much enamored with this sire's ability, his attitude, disposition, the quality of the horse, and she very intensely bred this horse through breeding him back to his daughters, his cousins, all of those sorts of combinations to produce a very specific type of horse. Now she goes out and gets blood from other pedigrees every once in a while. She's not a preservation breeder. She wants to breed high quality horses, but she also wants to maintain the blood of this one outstanding stallion. And this stallion right here is a great example of the type of horse she breeds. That picture is a good indication of his disposition. It's one of the sweetest horses I've ever been around. Absolutely outstanding. Very, very typey horses and really good little athletes. But it's been a very intensive breeding program. Her horses on farm today would all have about, the combination of all those horses are about 86% the blood of the original stallion that she started with. So she's had a very intensive breeding program. When we look at inbreeding and line breeding, they're essentially the same thing. Inbreeding is just a more extreme form of line breeding, or the converse is true. Line breeding is a more conservative form of inbreeding. What you're trying to do is concentrate the genes of some outstanding individual. The one thing you must do when you're doing this is to consider that that horse is in fact a really good one, and that the characteristics that horse exhibits are in fact marketable characteristics. In the case of Basie Tankersley's program, or Elmira Arabians is what the name of her farm is. In the case of that program, the characteristics that she was after, which are really, really sweet, good-minded, good attitudes with really a fair amount of athletic ability, it is very marketable. And those horses command high dollars, especially for those people that are really interested in following that type of breeding program. You must understand the results of inbreeding, extreme inbreeding especially. Quite frequently you'll see poor performance in the offspring. By poor performance I mean that those horses may be small in stature, may not get to the mature size that you prefer, maybe will be slightly stunted, especially inbred programs or extremely inbred individuals. They may show extreme characteristics that you've tried to select for. So there are some you need to have some understanding that you may end up with some poor performance in the offspring. In this type scenario, you sort out the undesirables, and don't ever breed known undesirables, so that if you know that there's a characteristic that is being produced in this line of horse. You try to get it out. You don't breed the individuals that show that characteristic. And you understand that this is a time-consuming venture. That if you're going to go to inbreeding, it takes a while to produce the product that you want. It's not to produce an immediate outcome. What you're trying to do is produce something that is very genetically prepotent. Now we'll talk about outcrossing in a minute, and line breeding and inbreeding are very important in regard to outcrossing. Many other species of livestock use this at a much higher level than we do. In the case of poultry, they will use very, very intensely inbred extreme lines. I mean, they'll be very intensely bred for a particular production characteristic. Then they'll cross them on another inbred line that has been developed that has been emphasizing a different production characteristic. When they cross those two together, they end up with some very remarkable outcomes. And it's my opinion that when you do inbreeding and line breeding, the primary reason for doing this is to eventually produce outcrosses from the inbred or line bred lines. And that's really what we'd like to do with this horse. This horse's name is Clem Dreamon. We'd like to use him on our horses, who he is totally unrelated to produce some outstanding individuals. Excuse me. This is a great example of an inbred pedigree, and if you're unfamiliar with pedigrees, let's just spend a little bit of time talking about this. One of the terms that you'll hear people use frequently is the top side or bottom side of the pedigree. This horse's name was Wisdom. He's a registered Arabian stallion and was born in 1976. If you take and draw a line right behind Wisdom's name all the way across this pedigree, those animals on top of the pedigree are considered on the top side, and the bottom side is those animals on below that line. That would in fact be from, the top side would be from his sire Bosk, the bottom side from his dam Wisteria. In Polish, W's are pronounced as V's. So her name is Wisteria. And this is a very intensely bred pedigree, because Wisteria was by a horse called Bosk out of Vitraz, and Vitraz was also the sire of out of a Vitraz daughter, excuse me, and Vitraz was also the sire of Bosk. So Wisteria was the product of a half-brother, half-sister mating. She was by Bosk, and then she was taken and bred back to Bosk, her own sire, to produce this horse called Wisdom. Wisdom himself was not an outstanding individual to look at. He had many of the characteristics of Bosk, which is what they were trying to reproduce, but he was an outstanding breeding horse. Really did a great job as a sire. It wasn't probably as popular as he should have been, because he really carried the right kind of genetics. But the reason he wasn't as popular was because the horse didn't look like people expected him to. And if you know anything about inbreeding, he in fact looked a lot like you would have expected him to, in that he wasn't as developed, wasn't as conformationally correct, but he had many of the characteristics and passed those on to his offspring. But this is an example of a very intensely inbred horse. The other things I wanted to mention about this pedigree is that when we talk about sire lines, this would be the sire line, which goes back to Cohilan Hafi, or Hafi. So he's of the sire line of Cohilan Hafi through Ophir, Vitraz, and then to Bosk. So Wisdom's of that same sire line. The dam line would be this line down here, all the way at the bottom, and sometimes you'll hear this referred to as the tail end female line. So the tail end female line, or sometimes you'll hear, we do this a lot in thoroughbreds, they'll talk about a third or fourth dam. So Wisdom's dam is this mare, the second dam is Cosmosa, third dam is Canaria, fourth dam is Saga, and fifth dam is Jaga, two actually. So that's the female line, and sometimes people will refer to this as the dam line the sire is from, or the horse is from. Okay, so that gives you some sense of sort of what a pedigree is. Terms that we also use is that we say things like Wisdom is by Bosc and out of Wisteria. Those are terms that you'll hear people use. Whenever they say out of, that means that's his mother. When they say by, it means it's his sire. A lot of confusing terms in breeding. This is actually the pedigree of the white stallion on the page that we saw earlier. Actually, he's gray, he's not white. But this is the pedigree of that stallion, A.M. Clendremon. And if you look at this pedigree, and you look at back here in these yellow boxes, you'll see that there's an awful lot of horses that are repeated in here. And in fact, I even missed one. Raffles right there should have been boxed as well. But all of those horses are very closely related, so that this horse, Azrath, is in fact the son of Raffles, so Raffles shows up back here. Rapture has Raffles in his pedigree, so that shows up back here. So all of these horses are very, very closely related, but they're much further back in the pedigree than they were in the previous slide. Quite frequently, people refer to this as line breeding, and in the case of the pedigree we saw earlier on Wisdom, that would be referred to as very intense inbreeding. Very different types of scenarios. And the reason for the difference, I'll go back to that slide, this tends to be a safer method and is used more frequently. The reason is that you'll have tendency to see have less problems immediately. Horses, you won't see the same sort of effects as inbreeding. Horses may not be real growthy and real good doing horses, but they're likely to perform better than very intensely inbred horses or inbred animals. We then have outcrossing as a possibility. This is breeding unrelated individuals in the same breed. You develop lines that have certain desirable characteristics and use those lines, may use lines developed by others and do this as well, but then you cross those complementary lines to produce an outstanding individual. The outcome is typically referred to as a blend. The Russians, in Arabian horses, the Russians were very, very effective at this. And in fact, Europeans are far more effective at using outcrosses than most people in the United States. In fact, most people in the United States don't recognize that that's what's being done in many of the breeding programs in Europe, is producing blends. It's taking two lines that are distantly related that may have similar characteristics or characteristics that we find desirable, crossing them and trying to get the best of both possible worlds. The problem with this, or the downside of this, is that this may be a terminal cross regardless of quality. And I'll show you a great example of this. That regardless of the quality that's produced in this individual, it may in fact be a terminal cross. What do I mean by that? That it's not something that is going to be very easy to breed or to produce the next generation out of, because these horses are a little bit kind of all over the board in terms of genetics. They may look outstanding, but they have some opportunities for hybrid vigor that other types of horses don't have, and that helps them in terms of their overall looks and performance. To do this, you must maintain pure or nearly pure strains or lines for this program to be effective. And what you're really trying to do with this is trying to produce an immediate outcome. An animal that's exactly what you want when you produce it. Because of what you're doing, you're probably going to have to maintain more than one breeding program at the same time. And in fact, that's what we have at Michigan State. We have a number of breeding programs going on. As I mentioned, we have the horses from Daisy Tankersley in Arizona. We have a line of horses that was there when I came to the university that came from England a long, long time ago. We have a Polish line of horses. So we have three strains of horses that we use frequently to produce outcrosses that we can sell and are very marketable as performance or show horses. It may be difficult when you produce these blends to find the correct mating for a blend, so that when you produce these blend offspring, sometimes they're hard to find the next stallion or next mare that you're going to use that blend on. Consequently, I will make blend matings where I know the offspring is going to be sold no matter what, because I'll never be able to figure out how that horse can consistently produce the type of genetics that I want to go on with. When you do breed blends, you breed them to the most distantly related line or family. It's not unlike a rotational crossbreeding program in livestock, so that you might breed two breeds together and then you cross them with a third breed to produce an offspring that still performs extremely well. Same thing happens with blend matings. In general, blends to blends will not work. Sometimes I produced a really outstanding blend stallion at one point in my career, had an outstanding blend mare at the same point in my career, and decided I was going to produce them together. They were not distantly related. They were very closely related, but both outstanding individuals, and the outcome was disastrous. It was not nearly as good as either its father or its mother, and that's because blends to blends will not work well. Occasionally they work, but they don't work well. They work well if they're distantly related, or may work well if they're distantly related, but still it's a little bit more of a potpourri. You don't know exactly what you're going to get. Hope you can see this pedigree. This isn't quite as clear as the other ones, at least not on my screen, but this is in fact the pedigree of MSU Start a Legacy. MSU Start a Legacy was by Huck's Legacy and out of MSU Eternity. And you'll notice that MSU Eternity and Huck's Legacy were the ones that we looked at earlier. This is in fact an outcross. There is no relatives on the top half of this pedigree that are the same on the bottom half of this pedigree. So these horses are very distantly related. MSU Eternity and Huck's Legacy are very distantly related. You may notice if you study this pedigree that Serene shows up here and Serene shows up there, but that is in fact all part of Huck's Legacy's pedigree and not Eternity's. So therefore, this individual, MSU Start a Legacy, is not line bred to Serene. He is in fact not line bred to anything. He is in fact a raw outcross and in fact a blend individual. And we'll show you pictures of him in a minute. Very successful show horse that the students have shown for a long time. This female line is one of the most important lines we have on farm. This mare is actually a granddaughter of the progenitor. MSU Eternity is a granddaughter of the progenitor of that line, a mare called Selfreda, who was actually bred in England and then was imported to the U.S. and Professor Good bought before I ever came here as a student out of Canada in the 1960s. This is in fact an example of an outcross. This is in fact Huck's Legacy and MSU Eternity. And as I mentioned, you need to be an evaluator. And if you look at these two horses, this is a horse that shows a lot of performance potential, very arching, very brilliant kind of attitude and very brilliant sort of presence about him. A good mover. He actually is kind of a frail-made stallion. He's not a real deep-made, heavy-bone stallion, but a stallion that has a lot of quality. And then we crossed him on MSU Eternity. And if you remember, those numbers were very, very comparable, or very complementary to one another. She's kind of homely-headed, not kind of homely-headed. If you see her in person, she's actually very homely-headed. But she has a great long neck. She's got a pretty useful shoulder in her, great feet and legs, big old body in her. And actually was an absolutely tremendous athlete as a hunter, but had a disposition that was at least questionable. Huck's Legacy, on the other hand, sires incredible dispositions. All of them are very, very trainable. Well, the outcome was MSU Start a Legacy. Far more beautiful than MSU Eternity, but every bit as athletic. And he has gone on and has produced 4 national top 10s, or he's been a national top 10 4 times. Has been a reserve national champion sport horse once, and this was by the time he's 6 years of age. We just recently sold the horse to Florida, and they want him as a very competitive sport horse, and he is in fact extremely competitive in that regard. If you score him, he's absolutely got an outstanding. Has outstanding conformation, really well made. But this horse was a gelding the day he was born. He was easily the best foal out of that foal crop at Michigan State. Why is he a gelding? Because this combination, Huck's Legacy and Eternity, is an extreme blend. And that extreme blend is going to be very, very difficult to try to produce offspring out of the next time around. Another thing that's used quite a bit is crossbreeding, and typically it's used in breed development, but there's still an awful lot of crossbreeding that goes on in very successful performance horses, especially in hunter jumpers, sport horses, those sorts of arenas. And you use it similarly to outcrossing, but it's much, much more intense because we can use two totally different breeds. The animals are not only distantly related, they're very distantly related. It may be tens of generations before there's horses that may be in common, or they may have in common. So it provides some real opportunities to take advantage of something called hybrid vigor. We do that in the outcrossing program, and we do it more extremely in crossbreeding. What does hybrid vigor do? There's a lot of characteristics that are passed on through hybrid vigor, or that are created through hybrid vigor, that cannot be passed on to the offspring. Hybrid vigor is not heritable. It is only produced when two distantly related individuals are crossed, and you produce what is more referred to as more heterosis than homozygosity, or in homozygosity, like genes at the same loci; in heterosis, different genes at the same loci. But we can use two breeds. Culling in this program to make progress must be extremely rigorous. If you start with a crossbreeding program and then you try to produce a breed from this or develop horses in that breed, it takes an awful long time to make that happen. That's why in most of the warm-bred breeds from Europe, they have scoring systems to qualify horses as breeding horses, and that scoring system is an absolute must if you're going to make progress within what really is a crossbreeding program, which hasn't started all that many years ago. The advantage you have when you're breeding something like Arabians or thoroughbreds is you have essentially a closed book that's been closed for 500 or 1,000 years, and that it's as closed as it can be. There's obviously been some injections of other things in there, but it's not been at any real high level. Progeny testing is very critical, and most of the time that's what's done with warmbloods, and you use only proven stallions that have shown themselves to be genetically superior to the other stallions within that classification of outcrosses. A great example of this is a horse called Cruising. Some of you may have heard of Cruising, but Cruising was a very successful Olympic-level jumping horse. Cruising was in fact a cross between a thoroughbred and an Irish draft. And I don't remember which direction it was, whether the thoroughbred was the mare and Irish draft sire, or which way around it was, but I think he was out of an Irish draft mare. This cross produces what's known the world over as the Irish sport horse. It may include other breeds, but this is the foundation and is still practiced today in Ireland. Some of the most valuable horses today in Ireland are the raw crosses between Irish draft and thoroughbreds. Here's a great example of some of the horses that are used as a thoroughbred stallion that we saw in Ireland when we took students over there last year. And this is an Irish draft mare. Actually, one of my, I didn't have a good picture of her, but that's a great picture of her foal. This is one of my very favorite horses that I've seen in Ireland. This is an incredible mare. She doesn't look like it right there, but she's got an absolutely remarkable skeleton, and she's this great, big, robust, heavy-boned, big-footed, very athletic mare, and she's absolutely beautiful. So those are the kinds of tools that we have. This is, I am out of time. I took a little more time than I wanted to. But that kind of completes my slide, and I'd like to at least provide the opportunity for some questions if you have any, and hopefully I didn't confuse people too much. It was a lot to talk about, and I talked very fast, and I apologize for that, but there was a lot of things I wanted to say, and hopefully you got a chance to get some insight, at least in the way that I perceive a breeding program ought to go. So with that, I'll entertain questions, if you have any. Can I identify the lines that produce Herda? I don't do enough with cutting horse bloodlines. It's my understanding that those are typically the Pocohueno bred horses. That's my understanding, but that may be an error. But that you can definitely find those lines if you'll simply, there's some really good papers out on HERDA that would help you with that. And you can identify those reasonably well. That doesn't mean that doesn't necessarily mean that all of those lines carry that characteristic. It means that that's where the characteristic came from, and obviously there were horses produced in those lines that don't carry that characteristic. I don't know that if there's a blood test for that yet or not. I think they've got the genes pretty well figured out on that one, so I think you probably could have that done, but I don't know that to be the case. Anything else? I either confused you totally, or I answered all your questions, or maybe I talked about things that weren't very interesting to you. What would a quarter horse line breeding program look like, or an example of one? Actually, there's been some of that done in the past. Wieskamp used to use some line breeding, real Skipper W stuff. He used to line breed a lot of Skipper W mares, where he would use Skipper W in the third or fourth generation. Used to do that a lot, and produced individuals that he found to be very, very successful brood mares for him. There was a guy and I always admired him as a breeder. He was one of those people that knew that when he was breeding horses, he always tried to understand that this was a 20-year project, and he was going to go on. He was going to go on with this long term. So he bred females. When he made a mating, he was thinking about who he was going to breed the potential female to before the foal was born. So he really was a very progressive breeder in understanding breedings. What if you were starting a breeding program with purebred horses that have allowed no outside horses in the stud book? That works very effectively. In fact, that's what I did with Arabian horses. If you look at a breeding program, any purebred line of horses, we look at quarter horses, for example. The number of different horses in quarter horses that show up in the pedigree. Now, it's not a totally closed stud book because we still have a chance to get some thoroughbred in there. But the reality is you've got so many different lines of horses that are available. You can do all sorts of things in regard to outcrosses within those lines. Even if you decide you're going to breed nothing but halter horses, you can do a lot of outcrossing. This would be Andalusian or Pura Raza Española. And what do you mean by that? Oh, that's the breed that you're dealing with? I'm sorry, Aaron. I didn't read that you were the same person. Yeah. Well, I've known some people in Andalusians that do a fair amount of line breeding as well. Some people out of Mexico that I dealt with when I was down there. And I'm not as familiar with some of that stuff. But they'll do some line breeding and outcross on some different strains of Andalusians. And Andalusians have been bred in enough regions of the world that there's a fair amount of variation within that population yet. You can still get some very different pedigrees reasonably easily within that population. So that's one. Now the Pura Raza Española, that's one, Espanola, is one that I'm totally unfamiliar with. I have no idea what that is. Perhaps you could enlighten us all on that one. Maybe everybody else knows, I don't. Same thing? Just different. Where does that terminology come from? Spain? Must be, huh? What aspect of marketability do I consider most important? I'll be honest with you. I finally, within the last 8 years, am finally comfortable with my breeding program. Primarily because the thing that I think is most marketable is having a horse that's one, trainable, and two, good-legged and structurally sound, that the animal's going to survive. I'll honestly say that my 2-year-old foal crop, which is one of the biggest ones that we've had, is one that where we have all the foals are very, very marketable because they have performance potential. Before that, I'd have wrecks every once in a while that I thought, what am I going to do with this stupid horse? And at this point, I feel much more comfortable in that I'm producing sound horses that are sound 90% of the time and have the right kind of disposition. With Friesian horses, there are yeah, you're right. And many are what are known as overbred, yeah, which are I'm assuming by overbred you're meaning they're very intensely inbred, with lots of disappointment in terms of performance, very strict registry. One of that when you deal with small populations, this is really, really difficult, and you already know that, so I don't have to tell you that. And what ends up happening a lot is you end up with horses that are very intensely bred, because everybody found one or two stallions or mares that were real successful, so they just bred the snot out of those lines, and now you got nothing to cross on them. There's probably opportunities to import some semen. I know that may be something that may be difficult for you to do. What I would always try to do with those is constantly look for horses that can be potentially outcrosses. Sometimes, now this is not always the case, but sometimes it makes sense to step down slightly in quality to get an outcross and then bring yourself back to where you want to be, because it's easier to do than trying to maintain quality within a very, very small population. I don't know whether that makes sense, but that's one that you'll find that is really a problem in small populations. When breeding for size, it is advisable to cross a 14-1 mare with a 17-2 stallion. I'm assuming your concern is with the size of the offspring at birth. It was my experience as a youth. I was brought up with Shetland and Hackney ponies, and we had Arabians on farm. We decided we wanted to produce some intermediate size horses for young people, so we crossed Shetland pony mares on Arabian stallions. And in every case, those mares had those foals normally. At birth, now those foals were born all legs, and they were about the same size as the mother when they got out. Some of them had to kneel down to nurse by the time they were 3 months old. But they were really wonderful horses. That cross will work. The mare normally controls the size at birth, and horses don't have as many dystocias as some others do. I wouldn't have a problem with 14-1 to 17-2. That wouldn't bother me much at all, but as soon as I say that, you're going to have a breeding problem that doesn't have anything to do with that, and you'll blame me. But that's a cross I'd make. Wouldn't bother me in the least, unless you've got a really, really coarse breed. I mean, if you're breeding to a 17 two-hand thoroughbred stallion, that's one thing. Breeding to a 17 two-hand draft stallion, that's probably something totally different. All right. Any other questions? I think we're just about out of time.
My Horse University and the Equine Network would like to thank you all for attending the presentation, and thank you to Dr. Shelle for informing us on the breeding program. We would also like to thank the following sponsors: Purina Mills, Horse Tech, and Iron Spring Farm. If you do have any questions, please feel free to email info@myhorseuniversity.com, as well as visit our website, and we also have a client services line as well. Thank you all tonight.